By the time the Kazarith gunnery crews powered up their cannons, the refugee carrier had stopped broadcasting. The ship had once been a proud civilian liner, all soft curves and panoramic viewports designed for slow cruises between garden worlds. Now the hull of the shores of Daybreak hung in space like a derelict blister, hull plating scorched black where Dominion tugs had grappled it and dragged it to this lonely pocket of the border. Inside, the Erume still clung to their hope. They packed into the wide lounges, limbs folded tight to save space. Their skin, once glossy with the subtle shifting colors that mirrored their emotions, had dulled to the color of old metal under weeks of stress and poor rations. Each Erume had 2 primary arms and 2 thinner secondary limbs suited for delicate work, all wrapped around family, luggage, any scrap of life they had carried out of their conquered systems. They had been promised resettlement, safe harbor under a protection treaty, a second chance. In the darkened command blister of a Kazarith warship, the treaty crawled as a footnote across a tactical holomap before vanishing behind layers of operational orders and range tables. Target Hulk anchored, reported a Khazari fire control officer. His eyes, set wider than a human's, flicked across console readouts. Auxiliary power minimal. Life support remnant only. Should we vent it? His commander, encased in ceremonial armor inlaid with black and silver, considered the display. She had been raised on stories of human stubbornness, of border skirmishes and bitter ceasefires. This little exercise was meant as practice for the new junior crews, a way to keep them sharp. Command had requisitioned a Hulk. Command had delivered one, with bonus challenges inside. Seal all outbound transmissions, she said. Jammers to full. We will calibrate on random internal compartments. Mark movable clusters as high-value silhouettes. Let the squads practice boarding beneath cover of live fire. In the bowels of the shores of Daybreak, Erume elders knotted their fingers around prayer cords as the deck shuddered. The first shells punched through the outer hull in blazing lines. Pressure howled out of sections that had been living quarters minutes earlier. Fire licked down corridors, then died in the vacuum. Compartment bulkheads sealed where automation still worked. In other places, doors jammed halfway, trapping bodies between. In one midship lounge where the hull curve and a redundant brace formed a natural pocket of strength, a cluster of families survived the initial barrage. They huddled together in the shrieking darkness as emergency lights flickered. Maybe it is an accident, one whispered, their skin flashing a hopeful amber no one else could see. In the Dominion warship's observation gallery, crews logged each confirmed hit, each successful breach, each simulated capture, as if marking scores in a contest. No one called the exercise what it was, murder repackaged as training. The galaxy's great neutral powers did not see. Transponder IDs had been falsified, jamming fields carefully angled. The only witnesses outside that system were the dead, and they had been carefully abolished. Almost. The shores of Daybreak did not obey the Dominion's plan. Structural braces designed decades earlier, by cost-conscious human engineers trying to impress safety auditors, held just a little better than expected. Instead of breaking apart, part of the ship bent and folded in on itself, creating a dense knot of wreckage around the lounge, where the surviving Erume had crammed together. In the airless dark around them, the wreck spun slowly, shedding glowing fragments like burning leaves. Far away, in a patrol corridor deemed quiet by every strategist who mattered, a human heavy cruiser drifted between stars on a course that would take it close to the fallout. On the bridge of ISS Dauntless, Captain Emir Kovac stood with his hands clasped behind his back, studying a holoplot of the border. He was in his late 30s, compact and solid, framed against the faint glow of sensor data. His dark hair was clipped short to regulation, and his uniform looked like it had been thrown on in a hurry and then straightened unconsciously until it sat almost perfectly. He was not supposed to be here. Parliamentary committees and fleet planners had drawn a clean curve on a map and named it a demarcation line. Human ships were meant to patrol their side, Dominion ships theirs, each pretending not to see the other's violations unless those violations were too brazen to ignore. But Emir had grown up on stories from the old diaspora, of convoys that vanished, of slavers who operated just outside the reach of law, of training accidents that always seemed to happen where the vulnerable drifted. So, when the Dauntless's long-range sensors flickered with a strange pattern in the empty slot between recognized lanes, Emir's instinct had been immediate and stubborn. "Backtrack that spike," he told the sensor officer. "Overlay with passive gravimetric anomalies." Lieutenant Lale Sethi turned from her console, the glow painting sharp planes of her face. She was slim, all edges and focus. Her black hair twisted into a knot at the back of her head. "Picking up decaying energy signatures consistent with heavy ordnance," she said. "Could be a live-fire drill. On their side of the Nada border, technically." Her tone gave away what she thought of that. "Any IFF?" Emir asked. "Negative. The field's noisy. Jamming residue, maybe. But there's wreckage out there." He looked at the tactical map. The Dauntless was not supposed to drift closer. He had standing orders. Avoid direct observation of Dominion exercises. Avoid giving them even the pretext of calling his ship a spy. Emir thought of his father, who had piloted civilian haulers through piracy zones and taught his children that at some point, rules are just other people's ways of washing their hands clean. "Take us to the edge of sensor resolution," Emir said. "Passive only, no active sweeps." Lale hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, Captain." Admiral Tomasz Rybak, far away in a fortified office, had placed Emir in this patrol sector because he was reliable, by the book, less inclined to grand gestures than some of his classmates. Rybak valued officers who knew when to look away. Emir knew when. He also knew when not to. As the Dauntless altered course with a barely perceptible thrum, its hull turned toward the mess of energy echoes ahead like a predator scenting blood. Hours passed. The ship glided under minimal burn, making itself as small as a cruiser could be. Shortly after 3 a.m. ship's time, a murmur went through the bridge. Lala's hands danced over her console. "Got something," she said. "Multiple debris fields. One large mass. Slow tumble. No active IFF. Running spectral analysis." The main display focused on a rip of torn metal. Amid the black, starlight caught on familiar lines. A civilian standard hull frame, bent almost double, riddled with punctures. Emir's jaw tightened. "Magnify. Look for heat pockets. Any internal power." The view dove closer. Sensor overlays painted faint halos within the wreck. Not many. Barely their embers, where intact compartments rotated in and out of shadow. "Life support traces in that cluster," Lale said quietly. "Breathable mix. Very thin, but stable. Energy readings consistent with emergency backups scraped to the bone." Emir did not ask whether he was supposed to pretend he had never seen this. He did not ask whether the Dauntless would risk provoking the Dominion by crossing an invisible line. He imagined being inside that twisted hull. Imagined knowing that there were ships within reach, and that those ships had decided the calculus of risk made his suffering acceptable. "Signal the wreck," he ordered. Standard rescue hail in all border tongues. He knew it was useless. Their outbound transmissions would be jammed, or whoever had done this would have already sterilized the scene. But there were forms to observe. No answer came. That, too, was data. "Prep a boarding team," Emir said. "We're going in." Dr. Hanna Beltran had been asleep for 30 minutes, curled on a narrow bunk, when the call came. She was used to that. Combat medicine on the frontier meant sleep came in interruptions and fragments, like radio bursts. She swung her legs over the side of the bunk before her eyes were even fully open, reflexes pulling her toward the nearest medkit. "Hana," the intercom rasped. "Boarding detail. To Bay 2, Captain's orders." By the time she reached the staging bay, the team was already assembling. Security Marines, technicians. Lale sealed into her own suit and checking the charge readings on her rifle. Hana's hair was an unruly dark halo around her face, hastily pulled through a tie. Her eyes looked like they had not fully surfaced from sleep, but her hands were already steady. She moved through the gathering cluster of armored figures, checking mask seals, slapping vials into pouches, triple-checking her own life support gauge. "Target?" she asked Lale, shifting her med pack higher on her shoulder. "Civilian carrier," Lale said, face unreadable behind her helmet's visor. Or what's left of it. Hana's stomach turned. She had seen too many accidental engagements on the edge of contested space. Any hostiles? No signs now, but there were weapons used recently. Fire patterns are messy. Lale hesitated, then shook her head as if to clear it. We'll know more when we get closer. The boarding shuttle detached from the Dauntless like a seed from its parent tree and drifted into the chemical dark. As it approached the broken hulk, Hana peered through the viewport. The shores of Daybreak's nameplate was half torn away, but she could still see enough of the lettering to recognize the style. She had treated passengers off similar liners when riots and famines had driven them across human space. Big, slow, gentle ships for people who wanted to believe in safe transitions. Now it looked like a carcass. They matched rotation, latched onto a relatively stable segment, and cut their way in. Inside, the silence was thick. Hannah's boots clicked on metal. Her suit's internal speakers translated the hisses and groans of cooling alloys taken too far past their stress tolerances. The air was cold, thin, faintly acrid. Emergency lumens flickered in strips. The first bodies they found were in a collapsed corridor. An Arume adult had thrown all four arms around two juveniles. The blast that had torn open the hull a meter away had spared this single knot by chance. There was no life left in the bodies now. The Arume's skin had gone matte, colorless. Hana closed her eyes for a trembling second. Lale watched her, mind doing quiet math. Probability distribution of impacts, placement of civilians. The scorch marks on the walls told their own story. This was no clean shot from a distance. There had been follow-up fire, repeated munitions. Ahead, the corridor opened into a larger chamber. Signs in multiple scripts hung askew. Lounge A. Dining. Recreation. It was a killing floor. Hana saw it before the others did. Bullet patterns across plush seating. Dark stains that had dried in arcs indicating panicked movement. Walls not simply punctured but chewed apart in controlled bursts at chest height. Kazarith Marines had come here. They had moved through these rooms, firing, correcting their aim, practicing pivot shots. On one wall, a child's drawing, miraculously intact, fluttered in the air currents stirred by the boarding team's passage. Little stick figures, some with 2 arms, some with 4, holding hands under a yellow circle. Lala's hands tightened on her rifle. They used them, she said softly, the words tasting like ash inside her helmet. This was a live fire drill. Hana's stomach lurched. The back of her throat burned. She cut herself off. She had almost said people, as if that were something that might be contested here. She moved through the devastation, bringing up her scanner. In the far corner, behind an overturned service counter, her screen flickered. Life signs, she snapped. Faint, but there. This way. They found the survivors in a jammed service hatch. An Arume elder had wedged a food trolley against the door, reinforcing it with whatever came to hand. Impacts had dented the outer surface, but not enough to fully punch through. Inside, they were packed 3 deep. Adults braced on the edges to give the children the best of the oxygen. Skin dull, eyes wide. When the hatch finally gave, their first reaction was not relief but terror. They saw armored shapes with weapons and thought they had merely reached the next round of their torment. Lale ordered her squad to lower their guns. Slowly, palms turned outward. Hana popped her helmet, despite the marginal atmosphere, ignoring Lale's hissed protest. She wanted them to see a face. My name is Hana, she said gently, her breath fogging in the cold air. You're aboard a civilian carrier. We came from a human ship. We're here to help. The Arume understood. Standard most refugee populations did, but comprehension had to fight through layers of fear. One of them, an older individual with pale markings around the eyes that signaled age in their species, lifted their head, secondary arms trembling. More games? They rasped. Their vocal cords, adapted for a different range, warped the consonants. They said rescue, and then their skin flickered weakly, caught between patterns of hope and despair. Hana shook her head, hard. No games, she said. We're taking you off this ship. We're getting you to safety. The word tasted uncertain in her own mouth. She did not know yet what safety would mean for these people. They carried them out. Medical stretchers for those who could not walk. Arms under shoulders for those who could. As the survivors passed through the ruined lounge, some of them saw the bodies still pinned under debris. The arcs of blackened wall, the drawings. Hana caught the gaze of a young Arume clutching a scrap of cloth between their fingers. She saw rage there, raw and unfocused. Underneath it, a numbness like a void. On the Dauntless's bridge, Emir watched the feed from the boarding team, with his jaw clamped shut so hard it hurt. His internal monologue was not elegant. Part of him burned with anger, part with grief. Above both, colder and sharper, something else rose. A calculation. He sent the logs, the raw footage, the sensor overlays, to Admiral Rybak with a priority flag. The Admiral responded faster than Emir had expected. His face appeared on the main screen, lines around his mouth etched deep. "Kovac," he said without preamble. "You have contravened standing orders." Emir breathed out slowly. "We picked up distress. We could not verify the source without approaching. Once we saw survivors." "I've seen what you sent," Rybak cut in. He rubbed a hand over his face. "It will be reviewed in closed session." "Sir, with respect, the Dominion cannot be allowed to do what?" Rybak's eyes flashed. "Shoot civilians? Use them as props in their training? Welcome to the frontier, Captain. Do you think this is the first time? The only time?" Emir felt as if someone had struck him. "You knew?" The words escaped him before he could swallow them back. "I knew rumors," Rybak said. "Unproven reports, denied by everyone who matters. Do you know what happens if I march into the council chamber and wave this in their faces? They ask where the recording came from. I say one of my captains crossed a demarcation line to poke a Dominion exercise. Then they ask whether I want a war declared on my watch." He leaned in closer to the pickup. "Listen to me, Kovac. You will bring those survivors to relocation Sector 9, as per standing humanitarian protocols. You will file a sanitized report of your patrol. You will scrub any reference to crossing lines from your official log. Do you understand?" Emir stared at the image of his superior. Rybak was not a coward. He had commanded fleets in brutal engagements, made impossible decisions. But now, he seemed tired in a way Emir had never seen before. A man who had discovered the limits of his own courage and made his peace with them. "I understand your orders," Emir said, voice flat. He cut the channel before the anger in him boiled over. Protocol be damned. Rybak could discipline him for that later. On the lower decks, in the hastily repurposed compartments where the Arume had been settled, chaos had given way to a brittle quiet. Hana moved from cot to cot, checking vitals. The survivors clung to the anchor points in the walls, unused to shipboard gravity fields. One of them, the elder who had spoken earlier, watched the bustle with wary eyes. Their name in their native tongue translated roughly to first among twining threads, but human tongues had trouble with the consonant blends. For convenience, the crew had started calling them First Thread. It was a title, not a name, but it would do. Emir came to the makeshift ward and stood in the doorway for a long moment, letting the scene sink into him. He took in the ration packs stacked in corners, the borrowed blankets, the way the Arume arranged their sleeping pallets, in tangled communal knots rather than separate rows. He thought of relocation Sector 9. He had passed through it once as a junior officer. Overcrowded berths, thin walls. Not cruelty, not overt neglect, but indifference, hardened into systems. A place you sent people when you wanted to put them somewhere, and stop thinking about them. He looked at Hana. "What happens to them if we dump them there?" he asked quietly. Hana wiped her hands on a cloth, considering her words. She knew Emir well enough to sense what was forming in him. "They survive," she said. "Probably. The mortality rates are not catastrophic. Food, water, basic medical. No one's setting them on fire for practice." Her mouth twisted. "No one's giving them much of a future either." Emir nodded. The anger inside him shifted, turned to a different shape. "What do you want to do?" Hana asked. Her tone suggested she already knew, and was both afraid of and drawn to the answer. Emir looked back at the Arume. Some sat in small clusters, heads bowed together, murmuring. Others stared aimlessly at the walls. One young adult had their arms wrapped around their knees, eyes fixed on a certain corner as if replaying something only they could see. "They deserve a chance to strike back," he said. "Or at least to decide not to be victims again." They're refugees, Hana said. Not soldiers. Those are not mutually exclusive categories, Emir replied. Not in the history books. He straightened. Somewhere deep in his memory, lessons from officer school surfaced. Doctrine and ethics. Sovereignty and consent. We can't keep them as permanent passengers, he said. But the frontier is under strength. We're short on boots, short on local knowledge. The Dominion is not going to stop with this one ship. We could do something different here. Hana narrowed her eyes. Different how? Emir met her gaze. Offer them a uniform, he said. Word of his idea spread quickly up the Dauntless's chain of command. Not all of his officers were enthusiastic. Sergeant Luis Amaral listened to Emir in the briefing room with his arms crossed over a broad chest. A scar ran along his jaw, a souvenir from a boarding action years earlier. His uniform was slightly looser than regulations suggested, evidence of someone who had retired once and been pulled back into service. You're talking about turning traumatized civilians into frontline troops, Amaral said, on a shoestring training schedule, with languages and cultures barely integrated. That your plan, Captain? Emir did not flinch from the bluntness. I'm talking about inviting volunteers, he said. Not conscripting anyone. I'm talking about giving them the skills to defend themselves and others. If they refuse, we still give them passage, treat them, relocate them. But we ask first. Ask, Amaral snorted. You think they're in a place to make informed decisions? Dr. Hana, seated nearby, interjected softly. You know what informed consent looks like in a disaster, she said. It looks like choosing between bad options, but a choice is still better than no choice. Lale, studying tactical projections on the wall, spoke without turning. From a strategic perspective, localized auxiliary forces have advantages, she said. They know the diaspora routes, the refugee channels. They speak the languages in camps we barely understand. If we keep treating the people the Dominion victimizes as someone else's problem, we leave them isolated and easy to pick off. Amaral rubbed his face. He imagined drill fields. Exhausted, brittle recruits forcing their way through muscle memory over the hollow spaces where their spirits had been shot full of holes. He was not sentimental about turning civilians into soldiers. Wars had been doing that forever, but he cared about doing it right. What would you use? He asked. Basic combat training? Shipboard security drills? We don't have the facilities to put them through a full ground infantry pipeline. Emir flicked a control. The display shifted to show an old schematic, a remote training facility on a marginal moon. Fort Sundridge, he said, half mothballed, historically used as a colonial militia training site. The infrastructure is there. Firing ranges, barracks, simulation pods. We requisition it as a joint training base. Amaral's eyebrows rose. And who's going to sign off on that? He asked. Headquarters is barely paying for ammunition as it is. I'll get Admiral Rybak's permission, Emir said. Or at least enough of it. He did not elaborate on the shape of the argument he planned to make to his superior that having refugees fight could be sold as efficiency to those who counted cost in numbers, and as moral agency to those who cared for other metrics. Hana looked at the schematic. Her mind leaped ahead to infirmary layouts, trauma counseling rooms, supply shortages. She also pictured the eyes of First Thread and the others, the hollow fury. If you do this, she said, it cannot be about turning them into our shields. It has to be a partnership. They must have their own leaders among them, their own say. Emir nodded slowly. That's the point, he said. We don't need more puppets. We need people who fight because they choose to, not because we shove them into the line. In the makeshift ward, when Emir came to speak, First Thread listened with the stillness of someone trying to hold themselves together. He explained as clearly as he could, with Hana beside him to soften the bluntness. We can take you to a relocation sector, Emir said. There, you would have food, shelter, basic care, but it is crowded and far from the front. The people who did this to you will not be there. The chance to change what happens next will not be there. He hesitated, then forced himself to continue. Or, you can stay under my protection, he said. We will go to a training base. We will teach any among you who volunteer how to fight, how to defend ships like yours. We will form a unit, a formal one, compact, rights, pay, representation. You would be under my command, but you would have Arume leaders too. First Thread's eyes narrowed. Their skin flickered with a faint blue, a color that in their culture signaled suspicion. And if we refuse? They asked. Then we still take you to the relocation sector, Emir said. You still receive aid. No punishment, no withholding. This is a choice, not a test. First Thread's secondary hands tightened on the edge of their blanket. Would you fight? They asked. If you were taken, used as shapes to be shot at? Emir did not need to imagine. His great-aunt had told him stories from the old wars, of being rounded into penned enclosures and used as leverage. He had grown up swearing never to be defenseless. Yes, he said simply. First Thread looked around at their people. Some met their gaze with obvious hunger. Hunger for action, for revenge, for anything other than another line on a list of displaced persons. Others looked away, hands trembling, their skin pale with dread at the thought of more war. First, Thread was very aware that they were not elected to this position. Circumstance had thrust them into it. They could not speak for all. They also knew that doing nothing would be a choice with its own consequences. Let us try it, they said finally. Volunteers only. You will write this compact down. You will bind yourselves to it, even if we are only. They searched for the right word in Standard. Guests on your ship. Emir inclined his head, a gesture of respect he had used for diplomats and senior officers. You have my word, he said. Admiral Rybak did not shout when Emir presented the plan over a secure channel. That worried Emir more than rage would have. You want to requisition Fort Sundridge, Rybak said slowly. You want to form a unit of refugee volunteers, train them as soldiers, and deploy them under human command in active engagements against the Dominion. Yes, sir, Emir said. With a formal charter, legal recognition as combatants, not irregulars, protections under our military codes, representation by their own leadership. Rybak sighed. Do you know how that looks? He asked. The Dominion propaganda machine will scream that we are exploiting their victims. The Council will split along every predictable fault line. There will be hearings that go nowhere, while people like those in your sickbay die in other hulks we never see. Emir kept his voice steady. With respect, sir, they are already dying, he said. Doing nothing to avoid bad optics is still a choice. We can show the galaxy something different. He hesitated, then played his harder card. From a strictly strategic standpoint, he added, this could be useful. Local auxiliaries, forces motivated on a level no human can match. It could free up our own Marines, extend our reach. Rybak gave him a sharp look. You're learning to speak like a politician, he said. I'm not sure whether to be proud or concerned. He leaned back, rubbing his temple. I won't get you full funding, he said. But I can sign off on reactivating Fort Sundridge as a cost-neutral joint training experiment. You'll get outdated gear, whatever personnel I can spare. If this turns into a scandal, it's your head. I understand, Emir said. No, Rybak replied. You think you do. You don't. But you're still going to do it. You're that kind of officer. He cut the channel, leaving Emir staring at his own reflection in the darkened screen. Fort Sundridge had been built on a rocky moon in the shadow of Karos Prime, a world of thin forests and stubborn settlements. The fort's original mandate had been to train colonial militias in basic defense. Then it had been half forgotten when alliances shifted and the front moved elsewhere. As the Dauntless descended toward it, its sensor suite painted a picture of faded glory. Old firing ranges overgrown with scrub, barracks modules with power trickling through only half their systems, a simulation hall that had not seen a full training cycle in years. Emir saw opportunity. Admiral saw work. They came down in daylight. The moon's thin atmosphere turned the sky a color between blue and violet. The Arume watched through the small portholes as the landing craft approached the base. To them, the rocky terrain looked almost like some of their lost home valleys, before the Dominion had ruined them. The shores of Daybreak could not land, but it could be parked in a high, stable orbit linked to Fort Sundridge by shuttles. Emir insisted on that. He wanted the ship's silhouette visible in the sky, a constant reminder of why they were here. The first days were chaos. Housing had to be arranged, language barriers addressed, schedules set. Human personnel who had signed on to a sleepy backwater posting found themselves in the middle of a social experiment. Sergeant Admiral stood in the middle of the makeshift drill yard on the third morning and surveyed his first volunteer cohort. Arum bodies lined up in uneven ranks. Their extra limbs made human standard stances awkward. Their hands were adapted for different tools. Their center of gravity sat just a little lower. Their eyes reflected the light strangely. Some looked at him with burning determination, others with wary resignation. "All right," Admiral called, voice carrying across the yard. "My name is Sergeant Luis Admiral. You will call me Sergeant. I am not here to be your friend. I am here to make you hard enough that you do not die the first time someone shoots at you on purpose." He had spent the previous night with Lale and a linguist from the Dauntless, designing a set of gestures and translational overlays to bridge commands. As he shouted in Standard, his helmet earpiece fed a translated version in the Arum's primary tongue into the recruits' earpieces, lagging by a fraction of a second. He drilled them in the basics: posture, movement, weapon safety. The first time an Arume recruit fumbled and dropped a training rifle, everyone in a 10-meter radius flinched. Admiral saw not incompetence, but anticipation of pain. These were people who had been under fire without armor or discipline. Their bodies remembered. That first night, he went to Hana's office and sank into a chair with a groan. "They're jumpy," he said. "They freeze when I shout. Some of them duck for cover every time something clangs. That is what trauma looks like," Hana said. Her desk was cluttered with files, medical histories, psych evaluations, treaty law. "You cannot just shout them into being fine." "I know," Admiral said. He rubbed his face. "But I have to shout them into being soldiers, or they will die." Hana looked at him. She understood the tension. She carried her own version of it. "What if we do both?" she asked. Bulwark Vale arrived 2 weeks later, in pieces. The simulation environment had existed on an experimental basis in a research facility, its funding precarious. When Emir's requisition came through, the scientists had half celebrated, half panicked. They crated up hardware, shipped it to Fort Sundridge alongside a small team of engineers, and sent over its central AI core with a cautionary note: "Still learning, handle with care." The first time the Arume recruits stepped into Bulwark Vale's main hall, they found a cavernous space lined with interfaces, haptic rigs, neural feedback chairs, modular walls capable of reconfiguring into corridors or plazas. The AI's avatar manifested in the air as a shifting lattice of light. Bulwark Vale, it introduced itself. Training environment, scenario generator, adaptive instructor. Please do not kick the walls. They are sensitive. The remark made a few recruits blink in confusion, then chitter nervously. Humor translated better than they expected. Hana worked with Bulwark Vale's engineers to adjust the sensory profiles. Human standard sound frequencies and visual cues did not map cleanly to Arume perception. The first time they ran a preloaded boarding simulation, half the recruits became disoriented or nauseous. "We are trying to make them better," Hana snapped at the AI after a particularly rough session. "Not break them further." "The original scenarios were optimized for human neurology," Bulwark Vale replied. "Adapting, suggestion, integrate Arumum cultural elements to provide emotional anchors." "What does that even mean?" Admiral asked. Hana thought of the knots of prayer chords she had seen, the rhythmic songs in the wards, the way First Thread had spoken of ancestral halls. "It means," she said slowly, "that we use their stories." Within a week, the simulations began to change. In one scenario, as Arum recruits moved down a corridor under fire, they found the walls shifting subtly to echo the architecture of their old communal houses. In another, emergency bulkheads bore patterns reminiscent of traditional protective sigils. The AI began overlaying faint audio tracks of Arume chants under the roar of battle, giving their minds something familiar to latch onto. At first, it felt strange, almost sacrilegious. Then, it started to work. Recruits who had frozen before when a simulated enemy rounded a corner now moved forward, drawing strength from symbols their nervous systems associated with safety and solidarity. Hena monitored each batch, fingers on the override. When someone's heart rate spiked too high, she cut the scenario and pulled them out, calming them with practiced words. Again, Admiral would say, once they had recovered. "We go again." He had not expected to be impressed by them, but he was. They complained less than human recruits. They whined almost not at all. When one of them fell, physically or emotionally, the others instinctively reached down with their secondary arms to pull them up. Their sense of individual achievement always braided with collective survival. Months bled past in a rhythm of training, adjustment, healing. When the first real test came, it felt almost anticlimactic. The Dominion raiding party probed the outskirts of Karos Prime's orbit on a gray, forgettable morning. 3 small vessels, fast and lightly armed, targeting supply freighters. On the Dauntless's bridge, alarms chimed. Emir's hands moved almost automatically. "Intercept vector," he ordered. "Lale, get me eyes on those raiders. Admiral, prep the first platoon of our Arume volunteers. This is it." In the staging bay, Arume recruits clamped armor over their bodies. It was human-made, but adapted. Extra joint plates, different balance. Their helmets folded over faces that had once only looked up at stars in contemplation, never in rage. First Thread, no longer merely an elder, but now a rank-bearing officer in their own right, moved among them, placing a hand on a shoulder here, murmuring a phrase there. "We go as we have rehearsed," they said. "We are not back in that lounge. We are not targets. We are lines of force." When the boarding craft launched, Hana was aboard, strapped into a jump seat with her med pack secured. She hated that the first op would send them into harm's way. She also knew there was no way around it. Training without deployment was theater. The raiders never saw them coming. Human Marines had already scouted their patterns in Bulwark Vale. The Arume units used that knowledge to slip in from blind angles, exploiting the raiders' arrogance. On one ship, a Khazari squad burst into a corridor expecting frightened merchants. Instead, they found Arume fighters using cover perfectly, firing in disciplined bursts, their voices raised not in screams but in coordinated calls. They secured the raiders with minimal loss of life. The Khazari prisoners looked at their captors with something between bewilderment and contempt. Refugees, in armor, orders on their lips. Footage of the operation made its way back to human space. It was first seen as a curiosity, then rapidly as a lightning rod. Alina Petrovich stepped off the shuttle onto Fort Sundridge's landing pad with her camera drone hovering at her shoulder. She had cut her teeth, exposing graft in port authorities, then moved up to war correspondence. When whispers of refugee battalions reached her, she smelled a story that could either break a career or make it. She expected to find lines of gaunt faces being handed rifles with no say. She expected to find a charismatic captain warm-talking atrocity. What she found instead was structured chaos, worn-out gear, and people who had clearly chosen the harder path. Her first interview with Emir took place in a cramped office that still smelled faintly of mold. "So this began with you disobeying a demarcation order," she said, eyes sharp. "Could have started a war." Emir shrugged one shoulder. "War was already started," he said. "The only question was whether I would pretend not to see." Alina suspected he believed that. That did not, in itself, make his choices ethical. She turned her drone toward First Thread. "Why did you agree to this?" she asked through her translator. "You had the option to go to a safe sector." First Thread's mouthparts tightened. "Safe," they echoed. "In a place where no one hears what was done to us? Where our families' names are filed in an archive and never spoken? We chose something else." "Do you feel used?" Alina asked bluntly. First Thread considered. "Allies use each other," they said. "Tools are used without being asked first. We were tools once. We are not that now. If your people forget our say in this, then yes, we will be used again. That is why we wanted you here." To record this part as well. Alina blinked. She had not expected that. Her reports, transmitted back through Brinkline Station, hit human networks like sparks on dry brush. Some viewers saw heroism. Humans pulling the oppressed into their circle, training them, equipping them, risking political backlash for the sake of justice. Others saw exploitation, a powerful species turning victims into proxy fighters, avoiding the cost of sending their own children. In Dominion space, the narrative was simpler. State channels screamed about human lies, fabricated footage, and staged refugee camps. The word puppets was used often. Behind closed doors, Dominion analysts watched frame by frame. They noted the recruits' movements, the integration of simulation-driven tactics, the evident trust between humans and Arume. They recommended urgently that this experiment be snuffed out. The order went out. A special operations team was detailed to infiltrate Fort Sundridge and make a lesson of it. They came on a night when Fort Sundridge's skeleton staff was stretched thin. A storm boiled in the thin atmosphere outside, ionizing the air, playing havoc with sensors. Power fluctuations turned outer perimeter cameras into static. Dominion stealth shuttles glided through the upper air, nascent lightning crawling around their hulls. They touched down on a ridge overlooking the base. Khazari commandos in adaptive camo descended, weapons slung low. On the command deck, a junior officer frowned at his console. Getting some interference on the outer sweeps, he said. Probably the storm. But Lale, reviewing tactical drills with Emir, looked up. Run a cross-correlation with gravimetrics, she said. If anything heavier than a cleaning drone sneezes, I want to know where it wipes. The analysis took a handful of seconds, long enough for the first saboteurs to reach a junction box and plant charges. The explosion that rocked Fort Sundridge was surgical, not spectacular. It cut off external comms, took out half the surface lighting, plunged corridors into darkness. Inside the barracks, Arum recruits snapped awake, hearts pounding. This was the nightmare made flesh, sirens and shaking walls. Somewhere between simulation and memory. Amiral's voice cut through the alarms. "This is not a drill!" he roared over the intercom. Defensive positions as rehearsed. Squad leaders, sound off. Bulwark Veil is live. Scenarios Alpha and Delta are authorized. The AI flickered to attention in its core. Confirmed, Bulwark Veil said calmly. Loading fort defense scenarios. Integrating live data. Friendly identifiers prioritized. In its hall, walls shifted. Corridors realigned to match Fort Sundridge's actual layout. Holographic overlays and physical space synchronized. As Dominion commandos pushed through the perimeter fence, expecting panic, they found kill zones. Arume fire teams, organized into knots around human NCOs, had been rehearsing this for months. Their extra limbs gave them stability on uncertain ground. Their cultural inclination toward communal defense, rather than individual glory, meant they held lines with stubborn cohesion. Corporal Karabo Nadlovu, his own armor scuffed from too many training falls, led a mixed unit along a maintenance corridor toward a breached generator room. "Remember your arcs," he called, voice steady. "Just like in The Sims. We've failed this one a dozen times. Today, we pass." A Dominion soldier swung into the corridor, expecting empty space. Kirabo's team cut him down with controlled fire, then fell back before a grenade could follow. In the medbay, Hannah braced herself as bodies arrived. Human, Arume. Some breathing, some not. She worked on autopilot, triage patterns threading through her hands. Her mind whispered that if they had had more time, she could have prepared better. She crushed that thought. Time did not bargain. The battle for Fort Sundridge lasted less than an hour. The Dominion had not committed overwhelming force. They had assumed surprise would compensate. When the last of their infiltrators tried to exfiltrate through a maintenance tunnel, they found it collapsed ahead of them. Bulwark Veil had suggested the charge placement. Arum sappers had executed it. 3 Dominion soldiers crawled through the dust into a shadowy chamber and found themselves staring down the barrels of Arum rifles held by hands whose tremor was not from inexperience, but from memory. They surrendered. The price was paid in blood. Arume recruits lay still on stretchers. Human techs slumped against walls. The fort still stood. At the funeral rites the next day, humans and Arume gathered in the fort's main yard. The sky over the moon had cleared. The silhouette of the shores of Daybreak hung faintly overhead. First Thread spoke, voice rough. We were told we would always be the ones between weapons and nothing, they said. Today, we were the wall. Today, we held. Emir, standing beside them, felt an odd sense of relief and dread. The experiment had passed its harshest test yet. That meant more would come. The decision to name the unit arose not from a human officer, but from the recruits themselves. One evening, as they huddled around a projection of their next deployment plan, an Aruum fighter traced the outline of their ship on the map. They used that name, they said, pointing at the label, Shores of Daybreak. When they lied to us, they said we would see light again. They looked around. I say we take that light for ourselves. Not the lie, the meaning. Voices murmured agreement. Daybreak. First Thread rolled the word in their mouth. In their language, the nearest concept was more complex. The moment when darkness does not end, but learns it must share space. Legion, Emir said softly. A term from our history. It once meant a massed unit of citizens under arms. It has had mixed connotations. But at its best, it meant people who chose to stand together. First Thread's skin shifted to an earnest green. Then we are that, they said. Daybreak Legion. The name stuck. Operation Hearthguard loomed like a storm over the next months. Dominion forces concentrated around Karos Prime. Human logistics lines stretched thin. Briefings began to include sober discussions of acceptable loss ratios. In Bulwark Vale's hall, scenarios grew harsher. You are not training for patrol duty anymore, Admiral told the Legion. Now a corps of hardened veterans, surrounded by newer volunteers. You are training to cut the spine of a siege. The Legion practiced boarding actions on holographic mock-ups of Dominion supply ships. They drilled breach entries, hostage rescues, sabotage. They also rehearsed impossible choices. What to do if they found civilians chained to reactor cores or used as shields on gun decks. Bulwark Vale's AI, fed with data from captured logs and prisoners, suggested maneuvers. Some of its ideas made even Emir pause. You're proposing we broadcast images of Dominion atrocities onto their own internal networks mid-battle, he said during one planning session. Is that likely to break their morale or harden their hate? Models suggest a mixed response, Bulwark Vale answered. But among lower-tier conscripts, shock may reduce combat efficiency. Hana spoke up. If we do this, she said, we have to be careful. We cannot become so fixated on winning that we turn suffering into a tool. Emir nodded. It was a line they would walk, again and again. When the Daybreak Legion ship slipped into the Dominion convoy's path during Operation Hearthguard, the stakes felt heavy enough to warp space. The plan had been simple on paper. Hit the supply line, cripple the siege, get out before heavy units responded. Reality did not care about paper. Aboard a captured Dominion tender, Daybreak fighters kicked through a bulkhead and found in its hold yet another cluster of Arume refugees. Shackled, terrified, marked on the ship's manifest not as passengers, but as live ordnance. For a split second, time stuttered. The past and present folded over each other. The smell of recycled air, the sound of distant impacts, the vision of armored figures stepping through smoke. First Thread's limbs shook. This is what you were. A voice in their head hissed. Shapes to be shot at. Then another voice, quieter but more insistent. This is what you are. The ones with keys. Free them, First Thread ordered, voice ringing down the corridor. Split the squad. Half secure the engine room. Half hold this compartment. The plan did not call for splitting. The plan called for a tight, fast strike. On the Dauntless, Lale saw their deviation in her tactical grid. They're off script, she told Emir. If they don't regroup in 6 minutes, they'll be out of position. Dominion reinforcements are inbound. Emir's gaze flicked between icons. Red, blue, gold. His hand hovered over the channel control. He could order them back. He could insist that lives be triaged by the mission's needs. He thought of the first time he had stood in the ruined lounge of the Shores of Daybreak and vowed never to walk past the wreckage of someone else's hope again because it was strategically neat. Let them work, he said. Adjust support. Lale. Shift our intercept pattern. Buy them breathing room. She nodded sharply and went to work, rerouting fire, moving human marines like chess pieces to cover the gaps. Daybreak's improvisation opened. In the tender's hold, freshly freed Arume stumbled as shackles fell away. They stared at their rescuers, disoriented. The idea that someone had come for them, that someone had not simply shrugged and filed a report, was almost too much to grasp. Sergeant Admiral, his armor spattered, grabbed one by the shoulders. "Can you hold a weapon?" he demanded. The refugee blinked. I was an engineer," they stammered. "I used to adjust coolant flows." "Good," Admiral said, shoving a sidearm into their hands and pointing to a nearby console. "Then this will be easy. You see that indicator? If it goes red, you tell me, and you pull this lever. Don't shoot unless someone comes through that door pointing something nasty at you." He turned and bellowed. "Everyone gets a job. No one stands and trembles. Busy hands, living brain." It was not elegant doctrine. It was human improvisation, rooted in a deep refusal to let paralysis rule. The battle stretched, snarled, broke. The Daybreak Legion did not retreat when the mission timetable said they should. They pushed deeper into the convoy, exploiting the sheer confusion caused by the idea of targets firing back with precision. On the comnet, voices overlapped with gunfire, with bulwark veils calm prompts, with the ragged breathing of recruits who realized, mid-charge, that they were not afraid in the same way anymore. Fear was still there, but it had been joined by something else, the knowledge that their actions carried weight far beyond their own survival. Far away, Alina Petrovich sat in a cramped booth on Brinkline Station, listening to a stream of raw feeds. Officially, she was supposed to distill these into edited segments, scrubbed of operational details, wrapped in soothing commentary that would not panic civilians or give politicians ulcers. She looked at the footage. Arume hauling other Arume out of Dominion chains, humans and non-humans fighting shoulder to shoulder, bullet-pocked walls that looked too much like the ones she had seen in Hana's early recordings. She made a choice. "Send it all," she told her editor. "Live, full context. Let people see." "You're asking to be shut down," her editor warned. "You're also about to make half the neutral worlds very, very upset." Alina smiled thinly. "Somebody needs to be upset," she said. "The right people." The broadcast went out. On Telnari orbital platforms, citizens stopping for their morning meals found their public screens hijacked by the sight of Arum fighters storming a Dominion bridge. The captions were clear. These were refugees, trained by humans, liberating others. On human worlds, parents watched and wondered whether they wanted their children anywhere near such fights, even as a secret pride unfurled in their chests. In Dominion command bunkers, officers clenched their fists and swore. Not at the brutality on display, they were used to that, but at the way it was reframed, not as their power, but as their crime. Their response was swift. The heavy cruisers they sent after Emir were more ships than the Dauntless was meant to face. Fleet engagements were supposed to involve balanced forces, carefully arranged, with contingencies and flankers. This was a punitive detachment meant to crush a nuisance. Emir saw the numbers. He understood the odds. "We have an opportunity," he told his senior staff in Fort Sundridge's briefing room. "Lale, Hannah, Admiral, First Thread, Kirabo, Bulwark Vale's Avatar. They're peeling units away from the Karos Prime siege to hunt us. If we can tie them up, draw them off, we give our main fleet a shot at breaking the encirclement." "You're suggesting we bait them," Lale said. "With ourselves." "Yes." Hana frowned. "And the Legion?" she asked. "Do you see them as pieces to be moved to?" Emir met her gaze without flinching. "I see them as allies," he said. "Allies whose lives matter, which is why they must have a say." He turned to First Thread. "I won't order your people into this," he said. "If you stay behind, we will still fight, but the outcome will be different." First Thread felt the weight of the question settle over them like lead. They thought of the faces of the elders who had looked to them on the shores of Daybreak. They thought of the new volunteers who had come to Fort Sundridge, drawn by stories of agency that sounded almost like myths. They thought of the children playing in the corners of the base, learning words in 2 languages. If we do not go, they said slowly, others like us will still be taken, used. If we go, we might stop some of that. We might die, but we will not die as shapes. They looked at their council, at the squad leaders who had emerged through battles and drills. In our ancient ceremonies, First Thread said, those who took on great risks for the community did so after a vote, not by acclamation, not by a leader's decree. Each who would bear the danger spoke. Sometimes, people said no, and no was honored. Sometimes, people said yes until it scared them, and that yes was honored too. They turned to Emir. Give us time, they said. We will decide. The council meeting in Fort Sundridge's main hall was not polished. Voices overlapped. Some Arume argued that they had already given enough, that they had lost kin and blood and home. Others countered that no amount of loss would undo what had been done. Only action might. Humans did not speak unless asked. In the end, a slim majority of the Arume volunteers voted to accept the mission. Those who could not bear it were assigned to support roles: logistics, base defense, care for the wounded. Their no was not treated as cowardice. It was treated as part of the pattern. When the Dauntless, the battered shores of Daybreak, and a clutch of escort craft moved toward the rendezvous point, they knew they were sailing into the teeth of an enemy that no longer underestimated them. The battle that followed became known later, in history books and war college lectures, as the Battle of the Brink. It took place in the gritty space just outside Brinkline Station's security perimeter, where jurisdiction blurred and debris from old conflicts floated like a graveyard. Emir placed his ships near a dense field of scrap, old hulks, broken stations, the bones of ventures that had failed. It was a graveyard, perfect for ambushes. We show them a wounded convoy, he said. We fake communication failures, power leaks. We let them come close, confident. Then we make them remember that we learn faster than they think. Bulwark Vale simulated the engagement 100 times before the first Dominion cruiser jumped in. In many of those simulations, the Dauntless did not survive. The AI did not hide this from Emir. He fought anyway. When the Dominion flotilla arrived, their hulls bristling with weapon ports, they had already run their own projections. They expected a short engagement. They expected to leave wrecks behind as a warning. They did not expect the shores of Daybreak to come screaming out of the debris field like a charging animal, engines overtaxed, armor shuddering. On its sides, human and Arume technicians had welded improvised ablative plates. Its interior, once a passenger paradise and then a charnel house, had been turned into a launch bay. From its gutted lounges and promenades, assault pods erupted. The image of that moment would later be replayed endlessly. The ship that had once been dragged as a helpless target, now using its wounds as weapon ports. Inside those pods, Arume fighters braced themselves. Their hearts pounded, but their fear had a different flavor now. It was threaded with fierce anticipation. First Thread's hands moved over their harness. Remember, they said over the comms. They think we are expendable. They think we break. They have written us down as statistics in manuals. Today, we erase that line. Their pod slammed into the side of a Dominion cruiser. Mag clamps bit into hull. Cutting torches flared. Metal shrieked under pressure. A breach blew inward, and they were inside. Dominion corridors were sharply angled, designed for Khazari physiology. The Arume had run these layouts in Bulwark Vale so often that their bodies moved with eerie fluidity through them. They used their extra limbs to brace against low ceilings, to pivot around corners faster than human Marines could. As they advanced, First Thread opened their suit's external speakers and began to speak, not in Standard, but in Arum. They recited names, the names of those who had died on the shores of Daybreak, the names of those they had freed in the tender's hold, the names of elders and children whose memories had burned like coals under their training. The idea was Bulwark Vales, refined by Hana and Alina, turned testimony into a psychological weapon, but one with dignity. Khazari soldiers heard the harsh, alien syllables echoing down their corridors and, thanks to real-time translation overlays hacked into their own HUDs, understood enough to know they were not facing mindless rebels, but people with stories. Some fought harder, enraged. Others faltered. On the Dauntless, Lale fought a different kind of battle, fingers flying over her console as she coordinated fire arcs, shield angles, the timing of sacrificial maneuvers. One Dominion cruiser swung around, lining up a shot that would punch through the Dauntless's weakened forward shields. Lale watched the numbers, knew she could not turn them in time. Bulwark, Emir barked. Options. Option 3, the AI replied. Immediate deployment of captured escort hull as kinetic interceptor. That'll blow the core inside their weapon envelope, Lala said. Chain reaction. We don't even know if the remote link will hold. We know enough, Bulwark Vale said. Probability of dauntless destruction without intervention. High. Emir did not hesitate. Do it, he ordered. In the dark spaces of the debris field, an old Dominion escort, captured weeks earlier and stripped of most of its guns, flared to life. Its autopilot fed on Bulwark Vale's instructions. It swung in a wide arc, engines screaming, and rammed itself into the cruiser's line of fire right as the enemy's main guns discharged. The shot hit dead metal and overloaded reactors instead of the Dauntless's bridge. The blast tore the escort apart. Shrapnel hammered across both fleets, but the Dauntless survived. In the hangar of the shores of Daybreak, which had been hollowed out to serve as a field hospital, Hana moved through smoke and shouting. The hangar's curved windows, once sold to passengers as panorama views, now showed slashes of weapons fire. Humans and Arume lay on cots side by side. There was no species-based triage. She treated whoever was closest and most in need. At one point, she found herself standing over a Khazari prisoner brought in by an Arum squad who had refused to execute a wounded enemy. The Khazari's breathing was ragged, their armor slick with their own blood. Hana's hands moved to staunch the flow. We don't prioritize by who hates us, she told the Arume soldier beside her, who watched with a conflicted gaze. We prioritize by who can be saved. Why? The Arume asked. They would not do the same. Because we are not them, Hana said simply. The battle raged for what felt like an eternity, and, in the cold language of fleet reports, for under 3 hours. When it was over, 2 Dominion cruisers drifted as burned-out hulks. The third limped away, its engines sputtering, its crew too shattered to pursue. The Dauntless held its position, pitted but alive. The shores of Daybreak spun slowly, venting atmosphere from ragged wounds, but her core held. Shuttles flitted between ships, ferrying wounded and captured. The siege around Karos Prime wavered as Dominion supply lines faltered. Human fleets, coordinated with neutral sympathizers emboldened by the broadcasts of Daybreak's actions, pressed their advantage. The encirclement broke. In the aftermath of the Battle of the Brink, the galaxy did not suddenly become just. Dominion abuses did not cease. Politics did not evaporate. But on countless worlds, in camps and homes and offices, people spoke a new pair of words: Daybreak Legion. The concept mattered as much as the unit. The idea that those used as expendable flesh could, with human help, forge themselves into a spear pointed back at their tormentors, unsettled old assumptions. At Fort Sundridge, once repairs were underway and the immediate crises stemmed, Admiral Rybak came in person. He walked the worn corridors, pausing at memorial plaques hastily carved into bulkheads. Names in multiple scripts stretched across them. Emir met him in what had become a shared planning room, ringed by maps. You disobeyed the spirit of my orders at least twice, Rybak said without preamble. You made unilateral decisions that risked diplomatic collapse. You turned unaligned civilians into combatants under our flag. Yes, sir, Emir said. As you predicted. Rybak's mouth twitched. I should have you cashiered, he said. Instead, Command wants to pin medals on you and throw parades. Some of them are old enough to remember when we did this kind of thing more often, and they're nostalgic. He sobered. They also want to expand the model, he said. They're already drafting plans for other units, different species, different fronts. Emir's stomach tightened. He had known this was coming. Without the safeguards we put in here, he said, it was not a question. Perhaps with them, perhaps not, Rybak said. That is where you come in. He handed Emir a datapad. On it was a preliminary directive, formal recognition of the Daybreak Legion as an allied fighting unit, establishment of guidelines for consent, command structures, rights, and, between the lines, 1,000 ways it could be misused. They're offering you a promotion, Rybak said. Sector command of a newly formed integration corps. You'd oversee programs like this. You'd be in meetings with people who see numbers, not faces. You'd lose sleep, more than you already do. Emir imagined it. The endless arguments, the compromises, the pull between idealism and realpolitik. He also imagined walking away and leaving the concept to someone less stubborn. I'll need partners, he said. Not just humans. Rybak glanced toward the door. They're already waiting, he said. Outside, in the main hall, First Thread stood with other members of the Daybreak Legion's council. Scars traced their limbs, armor sat heavier on their shoulders. Their eyes, however, were clearer than they had been in that ruined lounge. Alina Petrovich's camera drone hovered nearby, recording. Emir stepped out and stood beside them. They want to make more of us, First Thread said. Copies. In other places, with other people. Some of those people have not yet stared down the barrels of the Dominion's guns. They may not understand what they are agreeing to. That is why you must be there, Emir said. To tell them the cost, to tell them the gain, to help us write rules that cannot be easily twisted. First Thread looked up at the arc of the shores of Daybreak, visible through the open hangar doors. We began because someone chose not to look away, they said softly. If we continue, it must be because more people make that same choice, not because they see us as a convenient answer. They extended a hand, their primary right limb, toward Emir. Then let us write those rules together, they said. Not in your language alone, not in ours alone. Emir clasped their hand. Around them, the base hummed. New recruits were already arriving, drawn by stories carried on news waves and rumor. Some were Aruum, from other camps. Some were from entirely different species. A few were humans who had seen broadcast footage and decided that their place was not safe behind lines, but at the edge, where decisions became flesh. In the quiet that followed, Alina framed her last shot. Her drone's lens captured the battered hull of the shores of Daybreak, patched and scorched, now bristling with new antennae and training equipment. She captured human and Arume technicians working side by side to reinforce its aging frames. She caught a moment where a small Arume child reached out to touch a human child's hand, both of them giggling at the static shock from a miswired panel. She recorded, but did not narrate. Some images did not need words. The war was not over. The Dominion would regroup. Other powers would test their own boundaries. There would be failures, betrayals, compromises that would sour some victories. But in one corner of a vast and often indifferent galaxy, humans had taken the worst thing they had seen and refused to let it remain only that. They had taken people others had written off as collateral and invited them into the messy, dangerous process of fighting back. Not as pawns, but as partners. It was not neat. It was not safe. It was, very much, human.